Hey y'all, just a quick word and then we'll get started, I promise. If you end up liking this story, then make sure that you drop a like and comment down below. It really helps with the algorithm. And if you want to show some support, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss when I upload. Now, with that out of the way, let's get started. I hope you enjoy. Bereshit, an original short story by Charlie C.C. Thomas. Simon sighed at his desk, rereading the scripture a second time, head leaning to one side on his fist as the other held down the page. He read it 3 more, always finding himself back at the beginning with furrowed brows as he tried to understand. With a groan, he shut his eyes and leaned back in his office chair, running fingers through his hair and wiping them down his face. He swiveled in the chair to look blindly across his bedroom, passing over the dark window before looping back around to his Bible and leaning forward. His eyes fell blank on the same words before he looked at his digital clock, reading 11:24 p.m. He sighed through his nose. What does that even mean? With all that Job goes through, why not just answer him plainly instead of showing him everything you do? He looked up at the ceiling. Why not tell him outright that all things are under your power instead of, well, it almost sounds like belittling. He shut his eyes and shook his head. Help me understand. I can't seem to move on, but I don't get it. He opened his eyes, left hand grabbing the face of the Bible as he finished. Help me understand why Job was content with that answer, even if he never understood what happened to him. He looked up, the Bible almost shut, and the dark room went darker. The outlines of the pictures on his wall, the edge of the desk, the seam of wall and ceiling, the shapes on the edge of his vision, it all went hazy and faded further into blackness. He breathed in, and the room was gone. The sound of his breath suddenly cut short with ringing silence. Nothing surrounded him, an empty oblivion, but it wasn't darkness in the truest sense. There was no light, but it was more of a lack of anything to see than true darkness, yet it stung his eyes the longer he looked into it. Then he looked down and furrowed his brows. He hung in the emptiness like floating in water, fully visible without a single shadow, as if light shone from every micron of the void. But his hair, his clothes, didn't move like he were in water. They stuck out exactly as they had been when he sat in his chair, as if frozen in time. He swallowed and squirmed as the air, the lack of it, danced on his skin, like heat and cold all at once, making him sweat and shiver. He looked around, squinting against the burn in the backs of his eyes, as if staring at the sun. His hands brushed across his chest and stomach, nails scratching up his arms and throat to calm the itching bristle of the emptiness on his flesh, tickling him as if tiny bubbles lifted out of his skin. He called for someone, face twisted in pain, then confusion, when nothing came out but silent breath. He felt his voice box with one hand and scratched with the other, trying to speak, but there was no vibration. Then when he tried to inhale, his lungs opened, chest expanded, but there was nothing. There was no air. For a moment, he thrummed with panic, but the longer he hung in the oblivion, eventually, he realized there was no need for air in that place. He swallowed, then tried to turn like he were in water, to move forward or anywhere else and get out of that place. And he might have moved, or not. He couldn't tell. He may have flipped upside down and backwards, but there was no shift of matter on his skin, no pull of gravity to tell him up from down, no light for reference of distance or position. In the boiling ice of the void, he found himself shivering, almost to tremors. His hands shook as he craned his neck this way and that, teeth chattering as he panted. Then something moved over him, through him, taking the burning ice from his skin and leaving him desperate for its touch when it was gone, leaving him exposed once again to the naked oblivion. Then something breathed, and Simon jumped, the whispering sound like a shout in the absolute silence of that place. The breath was long and full, slowly turning into words, another tongue, but its words stretched so far apart that he couldn't understand them, though he tried. Silence returned. Then something glowed in the distance. A tiny, faint pinprick of light flickered into being, as distant as a star but warm as sunrise. It grew, either coming closer to Simon or swelling until it was the size of a coin, then a baseball, the sun in the sky, and pierced the emptiness with light that felt warm on Simon's skin, shooting arcing rays of gold and white into the darkness. Bigger and bigger it grew, until it was the size of 2 suns. 10, expanding and rippling with a million pockets of 100 colors knitting together in a massless ball of light and fire and haze, surrounded by a warm aura. But around it, something pulsed out in a perfect sphere, nearly invisible save for the faint twinkle of light caught on the edge, like ripples in water. Then another came after the first, and a dozen more, 100, that swelled and swelled until the first wave washed over him. The cold fire of the void was obliterated, bathing him in warmth and heat that seeped into his bones and made him gasp, though there was still no breath to give him voice. He hung in bliss, limbs floating around him as the light grew, groaning and rumbling as another wave passed over him, then another and another, until they all rushed over him at once in a kind of wind. The warmth became heat and burn, making him wince and twist up his face, squirming as the light became so large that he couldn't find the edges anymore. Then he shut his eyes against the brightness, turned his head from the heat, and threw up his arms to shield himself as a wall of fire enveloped him. His eyes flung open as flames lapped on his flesh and clothes, the pain searing through him like he were being cooked and sloughing away as ash. Yet when he found himself, there were no marks, no char, only his flesh and clothes surrounded by a sea of light and untouched. It refracted around him in arcing bands, each one hitting another and becoming a new color that arced and found another to become a second color, and on in less than a second. Pockets of fiery light swam around like they were clouds, dancing in unfelt wind, some spinning together into cyclones, fat and thin, that stirred more fractal bands of shifting light. But all that he could do was open his mouth to scream as fire gnawed at him without a single bite. But there was no air. Then, just as fast as it had come, the fire left him behind, the arcing crystals of light flying off into the distance, filling the space inside it with enough light that it could have been midday. The heat still trailed over him, slowly turning to warmth and comforting stillness as those rivers of glory passed over him to carve more territory where they might dance their wild dances. He looked himself over in the cooling stillness and quiet, but there were still no wounds, no charred clothes, no blood or ash or bones, and the pain was gone too, replaced by the soothing chill of the new emptiness. Something different than the first, yet still empty. The darkness was dark and the light was light. The cold and heat were separated. The void there felt tangible, somehow familiar. But the black wasn't totally empty. Nebulous clouds swam together here and there, shimmering with their own light, though different than the fiery wall. Some were separated by miles, others leagues, some were so close they were almost one body, while others were so distant they could have just been stars to each other. A shadow moved over him, pulling his head up as a massive planet passed between him and the light of the nebulae. It crept forward at an angle until it came in front of him, edges a hard black against the nebulae, yet shimmering against the void with the ever fainter first light. Its face was blacker than pitch, blacker than the emerging space, without the haze of an atmosphere, but it was hardly smooth or still. Water churned across its surface in massive ripples that must have been waves miles high to be seen from such a distance. It swirled around itself like a nest of snakes, its skin boiling and freezing at the same time, waves as likely to evaporate to nothing as they were to crash into one another or solidify to crumbling ice. But as the seas boiled, steam and haze blanketed the surface until it became so thick the waters couldn't be seen. And again, something passed through him, relieving him of the cool void as a breath filled the emptiness, turning into strange words. But before the voice was gone, Simon moved with the invisible thing, gliding toward the planet and lowering like a deflating balloon into its air. The pressure mounted as he fluttered down, the thing still around him, and pushing against him with a familiar feel of atmosphere. He looked down through the haze, dew collecting on his skin, and jumped back with a sudden burst of red and orange light. Something roared and hissed, sending his hands over his ears as true sound replaced the void like pokers through his skull. He bared his teeth against the ache, but watched as the lights flared and burned beneath, the air swirling around him like a hurricane but never taking him with it, encased in the invisible thing. The winds rushed, whirling impossibly fast like time rushed by him until he broke through the clouds and saw the black, smoking seas. They tossed and turned like they were full of fighting crocodiles, blue and yellow lightning flashing overhead as all the world roared and hissed with a trillion voices, water exploding with each lightning strike. The writhing ocean beneath, the hazy clouds and smoke above, and Simon drifting between them like a snowflake as the water burst open with an explosion of steam and molten earth, sending shock waves through the water and air alike. In the distance, another explosion sent the ocean careening into the air, glowing clods of earth flying for miles and crashing back down with hundreds of enormous splashes, carving the clouds. Then the breath moved, wafting over Simon's skin, cooling him like a breeze in summer heat, like a fire in the dead of winter, and he gasped. This time, real air found his throat, and his voice traveled, but he didn't care as the breath surrounded him, sending goosebumps up and down his whole body. Tears welled in his eyes as the voice filled the air, a little clearer now, though still strange. Not a moment after the voice had begun, a nuclear blast of light and heat turned the whole world white and drew his face down as he blinked away the spots. The crust of the planet broke and turned up like giant scales, displacing the waters in a screaming torrent as molten earth glowed and hissed at the invading seas. Steam exploded, sending more lava into the air, and the thick veil of clouds rushed away in waves, crashing into one another and forming hurricanes and typhoons alike. Simon turned his head to look around, still miles in the air, and stared as the screaming world beneath melded with the voice around it, undulating with each syllable. Then a section of crust heaved up all at once like a jumping mountain, sending tsunamis of water flying fast as sound across the tumultuous ocean, colliding so fiercely they exploded when they met. The waters rushed back to the land to fill the void it had made, but the crust that had burst up was high and withstood the flood, though its cliffs were broken, and its valleys filled with mud and silt now. Simon panted, eyes wide as the black and brown land masses, alien in shape, crept over with something almost white, then pale green, spreading out from everywhere at once, and darkening like vast forests and jungles and grassland. In the north, the waters froze and settled as great ice caps, and all around some pale desert still churned in the wind. Then Simon fluttered down the last mile until his bare feet touched the grassy earth, and the breath left him. He turned all around and stopped on a sapling creeping up from the grass. It sprung up and up and up, branching out, skin darkening to bark as its first leaves gave way to larger, darker ones, a wild bush. And a little ways behind, something else sprung up from the dirt, crawling high into the air before it split and sprouted its leaves, finally stopping when it stood dozens of yards high. An ash tree. Whether they grew all at once or time rushed past Simon, he couldn't tell, but more and more things sprung up from the earth around him. Flowers, wheat and berries, apples, pears and plums, gourd, grape, and melon vine alike. Everything sprung up in moments and fanned out their leaves. Then Simon breathed, and his eyes fluttered shut as the voice stilled. 100 flowers filled the air with their perfume, the leaves drinking in the light he'd first seen, now dim as first light as it spread ever outward, and the twinkling nebulae that shone through the now clear skies. Simon opened his eyes and basked in it all, turning around and curling his toes in the dirt, walking around the soft bushes and brushing his fingers over tree bark. He grinned like a child and half danced under the black sapphire sky, all the world in starless twilight, when he saw a strange fruit on a strange tree of white bark. He smiled wide and rushed up to the trunk, licking his lips as he reached for one of its fruits. Then the breath swam through the branches, quickly followed by the words that were almost intelligible now, though in another language. He looked around with fallen hands, waiting for the next catastrophe to upturn the paradise around him, and he in it. But the ground did not open up. The waters didn't return, the clouds didn't crash down with lightning and fire. He swallowed, with furrowed brows, and moved between the trees, fruiting and flowering with cone and nut and pod alike, to a clearing of berry bushes and wildflowers. He walked through them, hands running over their leaves instinctually as he looked around the quiet wilderness. Then he looked up and froze in an awkward step, hands falling to slap his legs. A massive globe rushed toward him through the void, gray and white with tufts of molten rock springing up as other rocks rushed into its face. He stepped back, veins going cold before he swallowed and stuck in place, panting, waiting to watch the sky turn red and cast a wave of roaring fire across the world. But the longer he watched, the further it sunk under the horizon until it was gone. He shut his eyes and braced for the shockwave, but instead found still silence and the voice. He stayed there for a long moment, unsure whether to run or wait or scream, when a silver light bathed the ground, breaking through the branches behind him. He faced it and backed further into the clearing until he found the familiar scarred face of the full moon cresting from behind the distant mountains, larger than it should have been. Then the sky turned blue with a trillion lights that blinked into existence before they burst, turning the sky white and sending Simon to his knees, covering his head. The moon climbed higher in the sky as if hours were mere moments, another generation of lights bursting to life amongst those that hadn't exploded in the first. Most of them, too, shone brighter than the sun for an instant, turning the sky white, then another 5 times until the moon sank beneath the horizon. Simon tentatively looked up through squinted eyes that slowly went wide as he stood with a slack-mouthed smile and spun, drinking in the trillion stars that blazed in a million unknown constellations. They were no brighter than normal, but the plants seemed to perk up, almost stir in the new light. Some of the stars glided on looping courses, circling several times as the sapphire sky faded lighter and lighter until a warm light crested the mountain tops. Their snowy caps glittered, and the clouds turned crimson, orange, pink, and purple in an arching wave as if the sun were a king and the fiery clouds were an ornate cowl arcing over his head. Simon stepped back, breathing a laugh as his eyes watered, flicking across the sunrise and ignoring the burn of the fainter light as it rose, pulling up the day-blue curtain with it. The branches prickled through his clothes, but he didn't care. He breathed in the sweet flowers and shut his eyes, lifting his arms to bask in the new sunlight and spin with a climbing laugh as a few tears escaped down his cheeks. The invisible thing moved through him and sent up goosebumps, swirling longer inside him, and tugging at his heart as he opened his eyes and watched the world slide by like a hologram. Miles passed him by, sending him through forest and grassland and the hearts of mountains until he stopped near the sea, once again beneath the night sky. The breath came, stirring the waters like a gentle breeze before the voice broke out, clear as if the speaker were in front of him, but the words were still alien and undiscernible. The waters stirred, rippling aside from the breath's influence with a million bubbles and splashes before creatures, known and strange, flopped up in a teeming mass of trillions along the whole shore. Water splashed as the creatures dispersed beneath the weight of the steady voice, spreading out into the larger ocean. Then, as the moon set in the distance, things rose up from the horizon and called out, high and low, long and brief, song and screech alike, and creatures swarmed the skies in their millions and billions, eclipsing the fading starlight with their wings. Then, as the flyers headed for land, something splashed in the distant ocean. When he turned to find it, a massive whale crested the surface before crashing back down. Then another. Then something else, long and slender as a serpent. Then dolphins. Then things like dolphins. Then a rumble shook the ground behind him, and he whirled, falling back into the sand as a giant scaled thing lifted its billed head from a slender neck like it had risen out of the dirt. It rose to its feet as the sun crested to noon, massive, the biggest animal Simon had ever seen, and shook the sand off of itself, letting out a call that another creature answered elsewhere, and another, and another. The sun set, and the moon rose, and the voice came again, speaking louder, the words almost recognizable as something bayed and whinnied and howled. He turned further inland, and the invisible thing gripped him, pulling him over the land without a smack from branches or a lift of his foot until he stopped suddenly atop a hill. Beneath, the valley was wide and grassy with clusters of trees, between which humps of turf shifted as if something pushed from within. The mounds undulated and trembled, tearing in a flurry of soil and stones as paws, muzzles, and backs broke through in a cascade of voices. Animals crawled and climbed out of their strange burrows, ferrets, mice, lizards, and insects, yes, but also horses, cats, dogs, elephants, goats, boars, and bears. Every animal Simon had heard of, and plenty he hadn't, crawled onto strong legs and shook the dirt from fur and scale before looking around and sniffing one another. A few took to eating the grass and leaves, while others roamed and called out for their own kind. The crocodiles slithered onto the banks of the rivers, the frogs hopped atop wet rocks. The ants began quick work of digging out their burrows into colonies as the bees busied themselves with the flowers. Birds fluttered between the branches and soared high overhead alongside other things too big to be birds, with massive, membranous wings. Chatter filled the air, a cacophony and choir all at once, as if the beasts wanted to make up for the long silence, or ask each other a million questions about what in the world all of this was. Then giant things moved over the face of the day sky and called out so loudly that everything jumped and looked around for it. Great long necks crested beneath the greater light as other scaled things roamed together in small herds, tentatively peeking their billed and beaked heads from between the trees to investigate the smaller, furred creatures. Then the voice came clear, as if from beside Simon, and this time he understood. "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." The invisible thing gripped Simon as the sun crested near its zenith, sliding him through the world and across a desert to a broad, calm river surrounded by reeds and grass, with larger trees further out. A man in strange clothes, whiter than the white sand shores, sat on his heels, leaning over something near the bank. Simon approached in an arc to find the man's face, swallowing, and hands trembling at the faint glow surrounding him. Then he stopped at the man's profile. He was beautiful. So stunning, Simon couldn't look away, with skin and hair unnaturally white and shining. He was so beautiful, Simon didn't think to look down at what the man was doing, until he bent and opened his mouth over the likeness of a man's face formed from sand and clay. The shining man breathed, sending chills across Simon's body as it echoed, the same breath that he'd heard from the beginning. His mouth parted as the sand sculpture shifted, dust falling away as the moisture seeped down into its heart. The shining man sat straight, eyes glimmering like molten brass as he looked over the sculpture and smiled, lines creasing his face, as the sand sloughed away. The sculpture moved, and living flesh touched the light, glimmering hazel eyes, blinking the sand away as he shifted onto his elbows and looked around, confused but not afraid. Then he found the shining man and furrowed his brows as he sat straight and emulated the other's pose. The shining man smiled wider and gave a chuckle, holding the man's face and wiping the sand from his eyes. The man smiled and pulled his head back like a child who's been tickled. Then he shook his head until his black curls fell over his face. He stopped and looked at them, pulling them and smiling in a silent chuckle. Then he found his hands and arms and his body and felt his own skin. Goosebumps rose and fell as the man laughed, then found the other's smiling face. The shining man stood and offered the other his hand, pulling him to his feet and guiding him into the gentle river until he stood up to his naked hips in it. He dipped down and rubbed the water over his skin to wash away the sand, then suddenly sank down, lathered fingers through his curls, rinsing with locks falling over his face. Both men laughed as the shining one set him back into the water and pushed him down gently, wiping away his hair and lifting him back into the air. Then he pulled the man onto the shore, leading him inland as the sand turned to grass and fern. "Come," the shining one said in a jovial voice. "I've prepared a place for you." "For me? What will I do?" "You'll tend it and keep it beautiful, and it will feed you." The man smiled with a nod. Then the invisible thing gripped Simon, and the world slid past him until he stood at the base of a mountain. A massive river ran from its snowmelt and broke into two, then two again. But around its roots, trees and bushes and grasses peppered the open fields around it, coloring the green with berries, fruit, and flowers. Within it, animals roamed and flew, in and out they traveled, and at its center, on a raised hill, stood two beautiful trees. The world whirled by him until Simon stood beneath their boughs, one with black bark and glossy purple fruit between its bright leaves, the other with white bark and yellow clustered fruit amongst its red leaves. And the men walked up the hill, the shining one clothed and gesturing all around as he spoke, and the other naked and listening intently. "Every green thing you may eat, even of this tree may you eat," the shining man motioned to the green tree. "But the other, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will not eat of, or else you will die." The man furrowed his brows at that, looking between the trees, but only nodded and agreed not to eat of the red tree. Then the sun lowered and flared in Simon's eyes, sending him into a sprawl of flashing visions. The man tended the garden all around him, but his happy face slowly lowered and darkened. Then the shining one stood beside the man in the garden, with all manner of animals coming and going as he named them. Then the man lay asleep under a tree, and the shining man reached into the other's side as if his flesh were an open coat, pulling out a rib and molding it in his hands, pulling and shaping it as if it were clay. It grew and grew until the shining man had shaped it after a woman. In the next vision, the man and woman stood in front of each other, circling and studying the other with growing smiles before they approached. He held her face, and tenderly brought their mouths together. Then in another, the man and woman lounged in the grass beside the Shining One, all smiling and joking together as they looked out at everything. The Shining One said that everything was good. Very good. He blinked, and a serpent crawled along the red tree. Again, and the woman stood between it and the man, taking the cluster of fruit and eating it before she passed it to the man. Again, and two men fought in a field until one killed the other. He blinked and the planets spun beneath him, people spreading out and building cities, nations, as lights came down from the sky in the form of terrifying men. The men married women. Fearsome men walked above the rest, until there was almost none but the fearsome men themselves. The water, once held back, rose again and consumed the land as clouds stirred and emptied themselves. A massive wooden box crested onto a mountain top and perched for months on end as the water slowly lowered enough for the desolate, muddy land to be seen again. People covered the world again, empires rising and falling. Wars raged, blood covered the earth, great monuments rose and fell, forgotten, rediscovered, and lost. Then a man appeared atop a hill, naked and bloody, his joints out of socket as he hung from a wooden cross between two others. One eye hung from his socket as the other sat nearly shut, a crown of thorny stems encircling his skull as he looked up and said, "It is finished." The world rushed around Simon as history played out before his eyes, men and women born and dying generation after generation. New wars were fought. Symbols were raised, flags flown, calls made in the name of God, man, and law alike. More blood was spilt. Peace came and went and came again. Strife covered the world, then lifted and fell again. Then a man and woman were born amidst all of it, living their lives so close to one another, yet never knowing the other existed. They went to the same school, ate in the same restaurants, and had the same friends. They grew up. They worked. They found one another and fell in love. They married. She was pregnant. She delivered and nursed her boy. Then he grew in school and work and the Word of God until he picked up his Bible and brought it into his bedroom to read the book of Job and to ask God to show him why he answered Job as he did. The invisible thing shoved Simon back, and he opened his eyes on his desk, skidding in his chair and clambering to his feet as he whirled around. The window was still dark with night. The room hadn't changed. When he found his digital clock, it read 11:25 p.m. He stared at the Bible on his desk, swallowing with a tight throat and wide eyes. He panted, nodding as he reached out a trembling hand and set it atop his Bible. He shut his eyes, and the cool, familiar feeling seeped into his hand as that invisible thing lighted over his back, settling the panic in his guts. He nodded and opened his eyes again, turning back to the same passage in Job and reading from the beginning, eyes moist and spilling over as he saw the imagery for the first time, as he passed the same words that he couldn't seem to have finished before. He shut his eyes with a breathy laugh and hung his head. "Thank you."